In.
Alrighty, let's get started. Hi, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn on the 7 Basic Plots. I am Ashwaji Sharif, a junior designer and marketer at Voyage Communications, a presentation design agency where we praise the art for storytelling. The Presentation Thinking podcast, hosted by Mikey and Molly, has new episodes each Thursday, so be on the lookout for them wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you want a deeper dive into storytelling, check out Twist, aka This Week in Storytelling, on our socials, where each week I talk about pop culture, marketing, movies, and controversy and how they all relate to storytelling.
So fun.
So, what is presentation thinking? Aside from having a cool name and some of the most provocative depictions of Shakespeare that anyone's ever seen, presentation thinking is a place for professionals to go down the storytelling rabbit hole in the hopes of uncovering lessons to level up one of the world's most sought after soft skills, the ability to sell an idea. The team of visual storytellers at Voyage Communications is in the deep weeds of designing and developing presentations for some of the world's brightest business leaders every day, which has led us to the realization that great presentations don't just come out of thin air. They take a ton of work, and they don't just look pretty, they actually say something. And those world-class presenters you see upon the big stage, it turns out they aren't just book smart, but they can rise to the occasion, truly stand, deliver, and move everyone in the room. When the Ghostwrench team realized how we would benefit from studying a more holistic approach to presentation mastery, we decided to share those findings along the way, and that, my friends, is what presentation thinking is. Great presentations balance art, science, strategy, and performance, and the craft of presentation design itself pulls from so many disciplines. You can find inspiration from well beyond the slide, and I don't just mean on Pinterest. Presentation thinking is on a mission to pull info from the world around us, bring you fresh content and lessons that will inform you while expanding your view of presentation elevation. And one series of content is our bite-sized Lunch and Learn series, the Storyteller Study Club. Each month, our team of press thinkers will be zeroing in on one crazy specific topic, crafting a new lesson that we think will help us all gain a broader understanding of stories and how to better present. I mean, once we did an entire webinar on cover slides, we get pretty nerdy, so buckle up. Today, Molly is back from her deep dive of Christopher Booker's seminal work, The 7 Basic Plots, so that we don't have to read all 736 pages of that monster. Feel free to comment any questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. Molly has a background in film, media, and advertising, and later received a master's degree in gender and human rights to work in community development and to help nonprofits with their communications and storytelling. As a writer, marketer, and community manager, Molly's role works as a perfect trifecta to bring you today's Lunch and Learn, the 7 basic plots, how to strategically tell stories.
Ooh. Thanks, Asha, for the introduction and getting us kicked off here. Like Asha said, I'm Molly, and I'm stoked to talk about stories today, and I've got a lot of fun Disney references to make, so let's go ahead and jump into it. What is the shape of a story? I want everyone to picture your favorite childhood story in your head, whether it's Goodnight Moon, Three Little Pigs, maybe you watched 101 Dalmatians 101 times like I did, and I want you to think about what's the shape of it. Is it a squiggly line? Is it a circle, a heart? And when I talk about shape, I mean the structure or outline of it that a story follows. These plot points, twists, turns, and pivots. Every story follows some kind of shape, and anyone that's studied storytelling will tell you that there are a lot of answers. The most universal and widely accepted shape of a story comes from the classic philosopher Aristotle. It's the reason we put them on our Storyteller Study Club logo. And this is the 3-act structure, that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is Aristotle's phases of life. And Freytag, the German dramatist, took this a little further, where there's still 3 acts, but there's more of an arc. There's rising action, and falling action, all leading up to one big climax plot point, only for everything to be resolved or end afterwards. So if you were thinking about Goodnight Moon as your childhood favorite story, that might not qualify for Freytag just because, it's a flat line, not a lot of action going on there. But the point being here is that this is a journey not unlike a roller coaster. It's a ride you go on as a reader or an audience member or a consumer of some kind. It's often thrilling and scary and fun all at once. Another story theorist was this OG indie boy that, if you're a lit nerd, you'll recognize as Kurt Vonnegut, the writer here. And Kurt also tried to put a shape to stories in a comprehensive thesis that was rejected by the University of Chicago. So while Slaughterhouse-Five and his Cat's Cradle are on curriculums everywhere, he actually called his master's thesis the prettiest contribution to society. He said, quote, "It was rejected because it was so simple and looked like too much fun." Of course, after his death, researchers picked it back up, and he's actually credited with these 8 main story structures and found a lot of validity to them. So I include this anecdote not to shade Kurt by any means, but to show how proud he was of this work. This was clearly important to him. Great storytellers think about story shape, and if we want to be great presenters, then we need to as well. So that brings us to the 7 basic plots, Why We Tell Stories, by Christopher Booker. Christopher Booker was a well-known English journalist who worked as a journalist his whole life, but again, he spent his life writing this book. This was his magnum opus, kind of like Kurt. It is chunky. Look at this, as Asha said, a true Bible of work, published in 2004. 20 years later, Mikey and I came along and made a 7-part podcast series so that we could share the knowledge with you today. We were genuinely surprised with how this knowledge might be applied to a presentation thinking world. So with each plot, I'll be going through instances in which you can implement these plots into your everyday life as a story strategy. Missy, I see that you said my audio is echoing a little bit. Is that still happening, or is it better now? Asha, do I sound okay to you? Okay, cool. Just checking before I fully, start talking to you for 20 minutes. All right, so let's get into it. Each of the 7 plot structures is different, but many have the same elements. So to navigate your way through these milestones, Chris maps it out kind of like this. With Act 1, we have the anticipation, where you get to know the characters and the environment, but there might be some foreshadowing of something coming. And the call is when, action is set into motion, something happens. Which brings us right into Act 2, where things might be going well for a little while, but there's also challenges and frustrations. Act 2 is the meat of a story, right? There's a lot of back and forth, good things, bad things, until we're into the nightmare stage, where all hell is breaking loose and anything that could be going wrong does. This brings us to the final big moment, where the final driver, finale, resolution, a lot of words for that, where it finally ends. And if you're thinking you can pin these plots along our roller coaster plot shape from earlier, you are right. They might manifest in different ways for each plot, but they work to build out some kind of shape. Each plot point also brings a certain sense of expansion to move the plot along, expanding the hero's world, or contraction and compression, which adds roadblocks or obstacles. It's stress and tension for the hero, making getting to the goal that much more important and that much harder. So we'll map those out as we go along as well. First up is overcoming the monster. We'll get the scary stuff out of the way first. Asha, I'm gonna try this. I've never done it before, but we have a poll here. If you could launch that, see if it pops up. But I want everyone to just follow their gut reaction. What do you think is an overcoming the monster story? Alice in Wonderland, Frozen, Three Little Pigs, Ted Lasso. Pretty varied genres here. What do you think? And we'll share it in a little bit here. Christopher Booker defines overcoming the monster story as one where the hero must overcome some kind of threat to the world as we know it. It's usually a life or death situation. The hero is typically the only one, maybe the chosen one even, to kill or defeat the threat. And the monster doesn't have to be a physical monster, but some classic examples, and we'll share the answer to our poll here, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Dracula, the stories of Perseus, who's the Greek god who defeated monsters, War of the Worlds, Star Wars, all of these have aliens, monsters, and these are the kinds of examples that Christopher Booker uses in his book. But we know to make messages really stick, we should often revert to childlike simplicity, right? So I see that we've got Three Little Pigs as the winner, which I think has some overcoming the monster elements. But as you'll see here, we're going to bring in Frozen.
Let it go.
Because what better piece of childlike simplicity has gotten stuck in people's heads over the last 10 years? That music is everywhere. So for each plot, we're going to bring in a Pixar or a Disney example to really make the message stick. If you weren't aware, Frozen is inspired by the 1800s fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, The Snow Queen. So kind of fits in perfectly. In Act 1, we have that anticipation. The threat of the monster becomes known when Elsa has her reaction at the coronation of Hans and Anna's love, and she leaves, she flees. The hero, Anna, is called upon to confront the monster after Arendelle has fallen into the eternal winter, right? And at first it's going kind of well. She gets a couple friends. There are songs along the way, but then she's hurt again by Elsa's powers. There's frustration, and they're driven away. Now the nightmare stage is when everything is hitting the fan, and Hans's men are after Elsa after he revealed himself to be kind of a jerk, and Anna is severely injured by the ice monster, and it's always at this stage that appears all hope is lost until the final driver leads to some kind of restoration. Anna jumps in front of Hans's attack, sorry, spoiler alert, thus saving herself and her sister in an act of true love. So the monster isn't just one Godzilla or Frankenstein here, it's the power that Elsa has that she doesn't know what to do with that someone else wants to exploit, right? And it's also something that everyone has to overcome and outwit the odds against them. So one could view Elsa as the hero and Hans as the monster, or Elsa's ice powers as the monster and Anna as the hero. It's kind of a combo. But here's the shape that plot makes. So we've got following the expansion plot points moving upwards and the contraction compression plots bringing obstacles downwards, where it's like holding the hero back from what they really, really want. But like, what does this mean for us, right? Presentation thinkers. I know you're interested in how these story shapes can be applied to our product marketing, brand messaging, or speaker world. So these in the wild examples will showcase at least one way to implement this kind of plot shape into an aligning project. In our presentation world, I think one obvious monster is death by PowerPoint. It's overdone, there's too much text, we're way too obsessed with narrowing down slides when we should be narrowing down content, right? Advertiser Mark Benioff is the CEO of Salesforce, and he's known for these like crazy advertising stunts. You might recognize this anti-software mascot. He hired at a CBIL conference, which was a company later acquired by Oracle, fake protesters to be against software, and this got to draw attention. And this stunt got the cops called. Lots of attention. Of course, Salesforce is also a software company, but it was the stunt that got the attention. So overcoming the monster also includes picking a fight, calling out the bullshit, and leveling with an enemy or a rival. Something advertisers can do really well and really creatively. So presentation designers, it's a plot for you for overcoming death by PowerPoint, advertisers, and even writers and content creators with the evolution of AI and dealing with ways to stay original and authentic. I don't want to say overcoming the monster is a super defensive story shape, but it definitely involves putting up a bit of a fight. And if your product or brand offers a solution to an incoming threat, you should paint it in that light. That message and solution can show up like Anna with some serious determination, right? Next up is rags to riches. We'll skip this poll at Asha to save a little bit of time here. But Booker defines this as an ordinary, insignificant person is found to be quite exceptional. Classic examples that come to mind, we've got Cinderella, Great Expectations, Jane Eyre, David Copperfield, and even Superman. A lot of superhero movies are rags to riches. And while you obviously immediately classify rags to riches as Cinderella, we're going to talk about a rat in Paris. Ratatouille is such a perfect rags to riches story. He is basically a Disney princess, if you ask me. And we don't have time to go through every Pixar plotline in this much detail, but some key parts of a rags to riches story include, again, this anticipation. Booker writes about an initial wretchedness, he says, where we see the hero in a humble and unhappy state. They're usually very different than the others around them, but they're called out into the wider world. They get a taste of the good life. Remy's cooking in Paris. Things are going well. But there's frustration because, he's a rat. And after he reconnected with his family, he gets into that fight with Alfredo. This brings us into the nightmare stage where the creepy food critic arrives and everyone's supposed to be cooking for him, but the staff walked out, Remy's far away, and he's banned from the kitchen as a rat. But we all know the rats band together and help him out, and they end up starting their own restaurant. So again, we've got rising and falling action, expanding the plot points and compressing downwards until the final finale. All these scenes, someone who has seemed to the world quite commonplace is dramatically shown to have been hiding the potential for a second, much more exceptional self within. Somehow the moment of transformation when this other greater self emerges has a strange power to move us. Americans love rags to riches stories. We know that Dolly Parton and Oprah Winfrey kind of had a hard life growing up, but they made huge successes of themselves. It doesn't necessarily have to be financial success. Steve Jobs was an innovator, a new thinker, and he had a change for the status quo for the better. It's the character or person we follow from Act 1 that we want to be rooting for, and it's kind of an underdog story as well. Remy isn't accepted by his father because he thinks differently. He has a new way of doing things, and of course that's met with resistance from his people. And you might feel resistance when introducing a new product or a new way of doing things to your team for your brand's business, but ultimately this might paint a better life. Garbage to gourmet, flip phone to smartphone. Is Remy the Steve Jobs of Pixar characters? I think yes. This plot lends itself so well to entrepreneurs and founders, people that have like an undeniable passion for something, but it's almost too much to achieve from someone else's perspective. Artists as well, when they break a mold or venture into new styles, and given the right opportunities, that exceptional self emerges. And product developers and those who are always working to improve something, they can implement this plot style in the way they pitch products, new ideas, and improvements. So what's the better world you want to paint for people, and how can you bring them there? A rags to riches story really is powerful for this type of scenario. There's always a dark mode though. Dark mode can be applied to any plot structure by simply ending without a resolution or having the chaos in the nightmare stage amount to the demise of the hero or the hero's world. So there's lots of examples for every plot structure, but for rags to riches, Icarus is a perfect example. He flew too close to the sun, he got greedy, boom, he's done. But we will revisit that later when we're talking about tragedy. All right, let's see. This is one of my favorites. Number 3 is the quest. I would also call this one the call because it begins when a hero ventures out on a journey to answer a call or complete a mission that is impossible to refuse. This brings in some classic examples like the Odyssey, the Iliad, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Lots of Steven Spielberg fits into this shape. Lord of the Rings, only with an asterisk because Chris Booker has a whole chapter about that, sharing multiple plot shapes. Moby Dick is a perfect dark mode example where the quest actually consumes the hero. The quest usually begins on a note of the most urgent compulsion for the hero to remain quietly at home or wherever he happens to be has become impossible. Who does that remind you of? Frodo. The quest has these iconic and epic trajectories because it follows such an epic shape. But, of course, we'll start with Finding Nemo. So like all Disney plots, there's the sad parent beginning, and then when Nemo is separated from his dad, so begins the quest that is literally impossible to refuse. Like, it's Marlin's son. He has to go find him. Obviously, many Liam Neeson movies can be applied to this as well. Liam Neeson does not ignore a call to action. But one of the most fun parts of the quest is that more than any other plot, you get friends. Chris writes that a distinctive mark of the quest is the extent to which, more than any other kind of story, the hero is not alone in his adventures. He has helpers who give them positive assistance, ranging from periods of respite to crucial guidance. And you'll notice that these friends usually offer some perspective that the main character lacks, right? Like, Sam is never tempted by the ring. Athena helps Odysseus out constantly when there's a struggle, and Dory is just too wholesome for her own good. So it's something that complements the hero's need to get to their final goal. And Nemo, we know that his dad would not have survived without Crush the Squirt the turtle, Bruce the shark, Gil, and of course Dory. And they face countless challenges together back and forth within the journey and the frustration stage until they almost lose sight of their goal in the first place. until, with the grand finish, Nemo escapes the fishing net and he's reunited with Dad. Thus, the hero returns home with the fortune, the treasure, true love, saving Middle-earth, etc., etc. Lots of ups and downs for this stage, back and forth, back and forth. The quest is a highly useful plot in your day-to-day life for product marketers and presenters and speakers, because I know a lot of times those roles are one and the same. And that's because good presenters know you should build a talk around an audience and implement audience-first messaging. You're not the hero, make your audience the hero. It's also a good story shape for when you're pitching to investors or someone you're looking for money from, because you want to make them the hero and have your organization be their Dory or Samwise or Dumbledore. How do you make your call impossible to refuse, right? Nancy Duarte is a presentation communication expert. If you've listened to the Presentation Thinking podcast, you know we're obsessed with her, and she says it really well here. I'm going to play this clip.
So it was obvious to start with Aristotle. He had a 3-act structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. We studied poetics and rhetoric, and a lot of presentations don't even have that in its most simple form. And then when I moved on to studying hero archetypes, I thought, oh, okay, the presenter's the hero, they're up on stage, they're the star of the show. And it's really easy to feel that way as the presenter, that you're the star of the show. Well, I realized right away that that's really broken, because I have an idea, I can put it out there, but if you guys don't grab that idea and hold it as dear, the idea goes nowhere and the world has never changed. So in reality, the presenter isn't the hero, the audience is the hero of our idea.
If your audience doesn't grab onto your idea and hold it dear, if it doesn't resonate, the world will never change. So you can't take them into the new world you're building. So again, your audience is the hero. It's your job to make your call to action so impossible to ignore that they have to go on that crazy journey with you. So one more poll here, Asha, because it's fun and this is a good one. But I want to know which 80s movie you think is a quest plot. Again, just follow your gut reaction. I talked about this a lot on our Quest podcast episode because I thought it was a blast. I'll share in the next slide here.
So it was obvious to start with Aristotle.
There we go. Okay, what do you guys think? Asha, you can launch the results if you want. The Goonies, you're right. The Goonies is totally a quest structure. He gets all those helpers to come with them, and Mouth, everyone has like a specific purpose, right, along their way. And like I said, a lot of Spielberg fits within the quest structure. It's really fun. All right, next up is another kind of journey. It's called Voyage and Return. This is when the hero falls into a strange new world where everything is different and absurd. They return with newfound knowledge. These are just a few examples that Booker goes through into his book, because Voyage and Return stories are so many and so varied. But before you ask, I want to differentiate Voyage and Return versus the quest that we just went through, because they're both journeys. But the key difference is how they begin. Is it ambling or urgent? And by that I mean, is Alice accidentally being too curious and falling down the door to Wonderland? Or is it Frodo who is beckoned by the Fellowship to embark on his quest? There's a bit more seriousness about the quest journey, while the Voyage and Return hero might have spontaneously just slipped into the world on accident. A good example of this is Up. While Up begins with the most devastatingly beautiful setup of Ellie and Carl's love story, the actual story begins when Carl unwittingly falls into a partnership with a young wilderness explorer, Russell. And he does not intend to go with Russell on this journey, but he ends up in the strange new world anyway with him. And they end up in Paradise Falls together with a giant bird that Russell names Kevin, a talking dog. And these strange new worlds appear in a number of ways within this structure. There's one iteration where it's the journey through an obviously imaginary world or magical realm close to home, like Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, just the magical world just behind the door. There's also the land far, far away, behind the confines of home. This includes castaway tropes, time traveler tropes. There's also the version where the hero undergoes a change of outward identity while remaining himself behind a new persona. For Up, they are indeed in a world very, very far away. But once they realize this idealized world they had is kind of not all it's cracked up to be, Charles Muntz isn't a good guy. The end of the Voyage and Return stories always have to come with a thrilling escape. In the nightmare stage, they have to get out of there. Dark modes are when the heroes might choose to remain or remain trapped in the strange new world. And we know that Carl comes back from Paradise Falls a changed man and a father figure to little Russell. There's always something to be learned from the strange new world. and here's that story arc drawn out as well. The voyage and return story can also be when a hero is thrown into a new social realm or status like Devil Wears Prada, when Dorothy falls asleep and spends the entirety of the story in a very real dream, when a group of boys become castaways on an island, or when a mother and a daughter magically switch bodies. So as you can see, this covers so many genres. Voyage and return stories are an abundance of things, and the hero always returns a bit better, smarter, having learned a lesson. For the You're in the Wild examples, Voyage and Return might be a salesperson's best story structure. You want to bring in a new customer or potential client into your strange new world. Make it cool, make them want to stay there, but don't make it bad either. What can they learn and take home with them, right, and make it better? Email marketers, we want to know where people are, where we can kind of grab them as an entry point, and what kind of things do they care about that your product or service can complement. Founder stories, again, really lend themselves to the way with the Voyage and Return story, because a founder has usually gone on a journey of their own and come back to share it with us, a solution or service they've created after undergoing a story of their own. Motivational speakers are similar. They've usually ventured out and done something incredible, whether they intended to or not, and returned with something to learn from it. Now we've made it to comedy. Woo! Fun part. The heroes undergo a general chaos of misunderstanding until the chaos is miraculously resolved. This is one where the solution is relatively simple to finally restore all the balance in the story's world. Chris goes through several Shakespeare examples and even brings in a few Jane Austen examples in musicals there as well, Guys and Dolls. And that is because comedy doesn't mean that it's necessarily funny. Chris writes that it is not simply any story which is funny. Some very funny stories have quite different kinds of plot. Indeed, a story may follow the plot of a comedy without it being intended to be funny at all. So what is it about? What's a comedy? We've spelled out 3 main ingredients here. First, the audience is in on the ending. They usually know how it'll end, or it's heavily hinted at, right, throughout the plot. There's obstacles after obstacle. It simply just gets messier and harder for the main character to achieve their goal, or often for the two characters to fall in love. Finally, we have a deliriously happy ending, sugar cubes for that, because, as Christopher says, comedies often end in marriage. We all know Shakespeare plays can be categorized into comedies or tragedies, and to apply our 3 key ingredients here, Midsummer Night's Dream is a perfect example. The audience is in on the ending. When people went to see a Shakespeare play, they knew it'd work out despite everything and the chaos along the way. And in A Midsummer Night's Dream, if you think back to high school or college, there are imminent nuptials. Everyone has different feelings about them. Helena is in love with Demetrius, but Puck the fairy sprinkles love dust on the wrong person, and Lysander falls in love with Helena. It gets messier and messier, and if you remember, someone is even turned into a donkey, until the deliriously happy ending. All truth comes to light, and everyone is finally in love with the right person. Chris writes that the essence of comedy is always that some redeeming truth has been brought out of the shadows and into the light. Encanto, if you've seen it, it can be the Pixar version of a comedy. Mirabelle doesn't have a special gift when everyone else in her world does, to start out. And when she sees a vision of the casita cracking, no one believes her. It's not necessarily like laugh out loud funny, but there's some misinterpretation of truth going unnoticed. Bruno had never left the casita magical realm and only left to save the magic of the candle. Again, a big misunderstanding, a truth sort of obscured throughout the plot. And you'll notice there's no dream state in comedy because nothing really goes according to plan. This is all a downward spiral until we finally get a resolution. Families confronting their problems, people admitting who they really love, and so on. A modern interpretation of this plot is absolutely the romantic comedy. You, the viewer, kind of know what's going to happen, how it's going to end. That's arguably why you watch it. And the downward shape of the comedy is also why some people don't like these movies, because it's meant to be uncomfortable with so many compression points and nothing to expand the plot and move the heroes forward. You see people make absolute fools of themselves until, of course, and inevitably people end up in love and together. I'm giving 10 Things I Hate About You and She's the Man a shout out because they're based on Shakespeare comedies, Taming of the Shrew and Twelfth Night. Now, for comedy plots in the wild, the first and most obvious example is if you're a comic. You should absolutely be telling your most ridiculous stories to the audience and get them in on the joke when it makes sense for the most laughs. I think copywriting's another great example, and I'm thinking specifically of B2C copywriting, where the company is like, we've gone through 1 million iterations to get you the best flavor of Dr. Pepper, and you won't believe what the antics we got up to along the way. So make your product the happy ending. Save them the obstacles, but tell them about how hard you worked to get there, because then they know they got the best thing. And finally, for professional presenters and speakers, the great presentations can both be hilarious and move us to tears. And funny anecdotes that fit well within a presentation is something that professional speakers know how to do well. I specify professional here because the audience is already in or on, they know you're successful. They probably know who you are or what organization you're from. So you may as well regale them with some obstacles you endured along the way to get to the stage to convey some authenticity and humanness. And I guess we can't talk about comedy without talking about tragedy. This is when a hero's flaw leads to their eventual demise. Of course, we've got Romeo and Juliet, Bonnie and Clyde, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and some more Shakespeare classics, Carmen the Opera. Christopher Booker writes that this is when the protagonist is a hero with a major character flaw or a great mistake, which is ultimately their undoing. Their unfortunate end evokes pity at their folly and the fall of a fundamentally good character. It's a good alliterative sentence. Romeo and Juliet's unfortunate end was merely because of that great mistake, and the character flaw was that of their families that drove them apart. Bonnie and Clyde is a downward spiral crime spree that never comes up for air and eventually leads to both of their demises as well. Now this is where I'm bringing in the dark mode again, because a lot of times a tragedy story might start out similarly to Rags and Riches with the promise of some kind of wealth or the quest with some kind of call to be answered. And yet, Christopher writes that when the hero of a tragedy reaches the same point of the call, we're actually uneasy. We're aware that that call may not be of the same nature, but it's much more aptly described as the temptation. In Breaking Bad, Walter White needs money to help his family. We can empathize with this. But the way in which he answers the call and embarks on what would hopefully become a Rags to Riches or quest story consumes him. He literally becomes his alter ego, Heisenberg. And there are no Pixar examples because they just don't do tragedies since Fox and the Hound. So obviously in your work life, I hope there's not many instances in which you need a tragedy plot structure either, but perhaps as a motivational talk or a cautionary tale of what not to do or what to learn. Maybe in an HR instance where something has gone wrong and everyone has to learn from it, but for the most part, this is a structure that's good to learn what not to do. And finally, we've arrived at the final plot shape, Rebirth. Okay, I lied. We have one last poll, Asha, if you want to launch this one. Which movie is not a rebirth story? Another little negative here. I'll share in just a minute. Christopher writes that this is when a hero falls under the shadow of a dark power and is born again redeemed. So some examples of this, which we can share with the poll here as well, Asha. We've got Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast, A Christmas Carol, and The Secret Garden. Yes, this is correct. Lord of the Rings is not a rebirth story. We're all learning, yes. And Despicable Me, you might be surprised. We'll talk about that in a second. But we're going to talk about Beauty and the Beast. In Beauty and the Beast, you can view a rebirth story from either Belle or the Beast perspective. They both undergo their own rebirth process. But for this example, we're going to stick with Belle, who was the first Disney princess who could read. We see her cast in a dark shadow. Booker writes a state of living death, which is super dramatic, but she is indeed a prisoner in the Beast Castle. But it's not all as bad as it seems. They start being cute with each other and understanding one another's differences. But that dang rose is still wilting, and Mrs. Potts and Lumiere are still stuck in household item purgatory. This leads us to the nightmare stage, where Gaston and his henchmen take it upon themselves to kill the Beast, and Belle, though she is freed from the Beast, she undergoes a character change, and she actually returns to save the Beast, being the hero herself. This rebirth for both of them frees them, and of course, we live happily ever after. There's an element of right and wrong in rebirth plots. The Belle and the Beast both unlearn too quick of judgments. A lot of Christmas and holiday stories fit into this as well. The Grinch learns the meaning of Christmas. Scrooge reckons with his past. And Gru remains Gru, but he absolutely softens. Despicable Me is a good rebirth plot as well. In the wild, the first example is pretty obvious. We all remember Abercrombie and Fitch of the past, but rebranding, Rebirth, really helped them. In the early 2000s, Abercrombie advertising, the staff, and the products themselves were exclusively targeted to thin, fit white people, and even its CEO, Mike Jeffries, at the time said so, among other things. There was scandal after scandal until Fran Horowitz took over in 2017, nixed the preppy looks, and brought in a much more mature and minimal style. The Abercrombie & Fitch rebrand has worked so well, you might not even know this, that they saw a 43% increase in digital sales even in 2020 during the pandemic. So I would say that's a successful rebirth structure for sure. So rebranding is an obvious one. Public relations, any instance of controlling a narrative or pivoting a message. And of course, with any new product or business expansion, there's an element of rebirth, getting out of one state and into another renewed life. Now, as we're wrapping these up, I want to reiterate that all of these plots can and do overlap, and they should be used in tandem with each other. So if you think about your organization's brand messaging, what story shape might it fall into? And how does your next project fall into that overall brand story? They all have their uses, and it's worth trying on different structures and different scenarios to see what's successful or on brand or not. And why does this matter? Why am I talking about storytelling at work? Stories are incredible communication devices, and when they're told well, it makes your message that much more effective. There's a million ways to tell a story, but personalizing per project or per presentation can literally sell or market better. We know that companies earn 40% more revenue from personalization, and we know that people remember stories 22 times more memorable than information. How often do you hear someone rattle off a statistic to prove a point versus like a story? I heard someone about who experienced this, and here's what happened. People remember stories and anecdotes more than they remember data. Stories evoke feelings. Maya Angelou says that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And if Maya Angelou hasn't convinced you, Ben Horowitz, a successful investor and entrepreneur, says, a company without a well-thought-out story is a company without a well-thought-out strategy. Your story is your strategy. You cannot begin literally into Act 1 without it. Before you start your next project, I think it's worth putting some thought into who you are in the story, who your audience is, what the frustrations are inhibiting the big goal, and ultimately how to arrive at that resolution with the happy ending. So I know we're a little over time here, or just coming up into our 45 minutes, 5 minutes before 10:45, and I'd be happy to take any questions or thoughts, or if you have any of your favorite movies you want to like classify together, we can do that. So go ahead and throw them in the chat, or if there's anything in the Q&A box. Otherwise, we've got some things to plug. Sharing on Zoom makes it hard to see the chat, but thanks, Jenna, for joining. I got a lot of Ranchero support. Missy, thanks for the troubleshooting earlier. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and plug our next Storyteller Study Club next month. Go ahead and save the date. Our own creative director, Jeff Carter, will be presenting about problem slides. What's your problem slide on June 28th? And I think we'll have a response lunch and learn to that as well with solution slides the following month. So you will receive the recording of this lunch and learn as well as some relevant links and interesting stuff, and we'll include the information on our next webinar. So thanks everyone.